Welcome to our service at Stow and Heriot Church. Our reading is John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. A new beginning. In the beginning was the Word. This Word was made man to give us a new beginning. And John's Gospel starts at the very beginning, telling us that Jesus was there at the very beginning, at creation itself. It doesn't sound like the Christmas story we know so well. As we celebrate the joy of Jesus' birth, we recognize the fragility and beauty of a child. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke allowed us a view of the humble birth of a child in Bethlehem. When we hear of the manger where he lay, we instantly connect to Jesus because we identify with his humanity. And suddenly God was close to us in a way that could be touched and heard. And what joy we have seeing God amongst us, a joy that we return to year after year to take in the nativity scene. John's Gospel does have a Christmas story. It doesn't mention shepherds or a star. Instead, it goes back to the beginning and tells of Jesus' divinity and purpose. It is this divinity and purpose, this new beginning, that is our focus today. So whilst we have the joy of the Christmas babe in our hearts, let's look at John's introduction to his gospel, setting out the incarnation as an interactive mission. God made man. The beginning of Jesus is not a baby. Jesus was within God from the very beginning. John traces his gospel of the life of Jesus back to the beginning of the entire universe. That creation and life came through Jesus himself. When we view Jesus in this way, we cannot escape the knowledge of his divinity, the very light of life. And this light came into the world through the birth of Jesus amongst us. This light traveled from the very beginning of time to reside within us on earth. The world did not celebrate. Jesus was laid in a manger in a corner of Bethlehem. But there was no rejoicing in his honor, not even the hint of a welcome. The world knew him not. The world did not accept him. When John the Baptist announced him as the light of the world, Jesus would still be rejected by the world and crucified by it. So why did Jesus come? Given that the world was so unwelcoming, it was the will of God that Jesus came. Humanity was in a kind of darkness where it was difficult to see God, so the light had to come to us. Looking at verse 1, John states, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God." And then he returns to this description of the Word in verse 14. He tells us this very same Word was made flesh. Bringing these verses together, we see that the Word was Jesus himself. John shows us the divine nature of Jesus the babe, how from the very beginning Jesus was in God and part of a plan to unite us with God. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Humanity could not do this. All the children of mankind had struggled to meet with God. It was the will of God that we should meet with him. It was through the grace of God that Jesus came to us, born as a baby, taking on human form with all its indignity and difficulties. He became like us, so we could be more like him. Here at last was a perfect human life, a life full of grace and truth, a life born as a vulnerable child, a life that grew up in flesh and bone. This life was a new beginning because it was a life that was totally dedicated to the will of God. Yes, Jesus would need food, water, shelter, but Jesus would not make searching for these things the central point of his life. Indeed, he starts his life without even having a room in the bustle of Bethlehem, no palatial comfort or grand home for him. Instead of bodily needs, Jesus would spend his life focused on spiritual needs. And Jesus' life changes the whole relationship between God and man. All these things we usually strive for, a house, financial security, good food or nice clothes, these are not the things that Jesus strives for. He reaches out to do God's will, and in doing so builds a link for us to fulfill our spiritual needs. And it's a direct link. Through Jesus, we walk straight into God's kingdom. God writes that to all those that receive him, Jesus brings the power to become the children of God. The children of God is a direct inheritance. If we begin as the children of God, we go straight into God's house. We inherit his kingdom. We share in his blessing because it is the will of God that we should be his very own children. So what do we need to do to inherit? All our struggling around in the darkness has not achieved this inheritance. We need a light to show us the way. So we need to recognize Jesus as that light, that recognition of Jesus as God, that willingness to follow him. That is what unlocks this inheritance for us. Jesus will do the rest. How do we recognize Jesus? The child in the manger is so wonderfully human. We can gaze on this divine child at a distance and recognize a gift from God. At 8 days old, the infant was recognized in the temple by Simeon as a promised Saviour. The wise men follow as a star and recognize that Jesus is King. John's Gospel goes directly to who Jesus is. He wants us to recognize Jesus all the way through time as God's true light. John wants us to recognize Jesus in the very first verses he writes. The rest of his Gospel would be the proof. John takes us to John the Baptist, announcing Jesus as the true light. He takes us forward into the events of Jesus' life and ministry that allow us to see who Jesus is, so that we might receive him, not just in his humanity, but in the way his humanity shows us who God really is, how we should be, that we might accept God in the fullness of his love, shown in Jesus. Here, in the birth of Jesus, is a new thing God is doing, a creative thing to complete our redemption. Jesus brings into being an entirely new humanity, a new beginning for us, one where we can be adopted as God's own children. If we recognize the divinity of Jesus, then we can also recognize God amongst us. And in that recognition, the gap between God and man is spanned by a single child. When Jesus came down to us, we are ourselves elevated to a place where we become God's children, and with that into a space where a true and meaningful relationship with God becomes real. This new relationship with God is something to celebrate. This is good news that should travel with us in our new year. If you feel fear or loneliness, look to the new relationship that we have with God through Jesus. It closes that gap. God is shining his light on you. May the Lord bless this meditation on his word.